So welcome to Chapter 8. We're going to take a look at emotion and health. And you might at first think these seem like two different topics, but we will find that they are both very much intertwined. Emotion has huge effects on health and vice versa. So in this chapter, we're going to start off looking at facial expressions of emotion, sort of the what and why of facial expressions. We'll find that they are more important than they might seem at first. Then we'll take a look at the pathways and brain regions involved in emotion. And then we'll transition to stress, what happens when negative emotions or worry persist and linger, and some of the consequences for health. And then we'll look at aggression and its biological causes. So when we think about emotion, it's good to keep in mind that the human face has a whole lot of muscles, as we can see here, that do nothing related to, moving our bodies or doing anything really functional except to create facial expressions. We can move our eyebrows, we can move our mouths, we can, scrunch up our noses and so on. All of these movements don't serve any overt purpose except to create facial expressions. And that tells us something important, because natural selection would not have selected humans with this kind of facial musculature without those muscles being important for something related to survival. And so our facial expressions are critical for survival because we have this musculature on our face that is dedicated to it, to making facial expressions. And that means then that these facial expressions are playing a really important role. And we'll see that they play a very important role in communication. Now, let's take a look at these 4 photographs and think about what facial expression this individual here on the top left is showing. Yeah, right? His nose is kind of scrunched up, his lips are kind of turned down. In fact, I invite you to try and mimic that expression. See what it feels like. Now do this one, top right. The bottom left. And then this one on the bottom right. These expressions were generated by an individual living in Papua New Guinea who had not encountered Westerners before, had not watched television, had never been exposed to Western culture. And when Paul Ekman originally asked him to show on his face how he would react in 4 different situations, he made these facial expressions. For example, this one here on the top right. What happens when you encounter a friend you haven't seen in a while you're walking through the forest? Bottom left, you just got word that your son has died. Bottom right, you've learned that a neighbor has stolen something that belongs to you. And top left, you've been walking through the forest and you came across the carcass of a dead pig that's been there for several days. This expression on the top left is disgust. That's the one related to coming across the carcass of a dead animal. The one on the top right is associated with seeing a friend they haven't seen in a while, and so on. And so what's important about this is that we can recognize his facial expressions, even though he didn't learn them the way that we could have learned them. And so when we ask the question then, well, can these facial expressions be learned? Probably not. Because how would we both have learned to make these same facial expressions independently? And so that was the research question that Paul Ekman developed early on in his career. Here's a picture of Paul Ekman. And I like to just show this one because we can see certain similarities, of course, right, with other primates and in our facial expressions. But let me show you now this short video of Paul Ekman's early research.
soon after I got my PhD, I began working on gesture and expression. And it was clear that facial expression was very rich, but there were no methods for measuring it. And there was a fundamental argument between Margaret Mead, who said it was another culture-specific language, and the earlier writings of Charles Darwin, who said it's universal to the species. To answer that question, I needed to study people who were totally isolated, who could not have learned their expressions from the media, from seeing Westerners. They were the critical case, and there weren't many of them left. And so in 1967, I went to the highlands of New Guinea, and I studied people where I was really, for most of them, the first outsider they had ever seen. They were still using stone implements. They had no written language. They had very little clothing. I worked in a number of villages. I was a source of great entertainment. To them, I'd light a match. It was a miracle. Turn on a flashlight. They'd never seen anything like this. And most important, they didn't know what a camera was. So when I would hold one up and take photographs or films, they weren't self-conscious, because they just figured I was doing another one of my funny, strange things.
So Paul Ekman's research showed that human emotion is not culture-specific and learned, but that it is universal. Now let's take a look at some of the effects of facial expressions on us, on humans. And these effects actually extend to facial expressions that we only view so briefly that we're not even consciously aware of them. In other words, we're going to be looking at subliminal effects of facial expressions. Subliminal, referring to the fact that they're shown extremely briefly, 16 milliseconds, that is really fast, right? And they are covered up. The term is masked. So the mask is this other picture. Notice he has a neutral expression, so no emotion displayed on his face. And this picture is showed for 400 milliseconds, so almost a half second. This picture does get seen. The person knows they see it. It's perfectly, conscious perception. But these pictures that are shown before the neutral one can be either of a happy person or of an angry person, and then there's a control here for a neutral person. But they're shown so briefly that the person is not consciously aware of seeing them. So it's an example of subliminal perception. And what's interesting is that even shown so briefly and masked by this additional photograph, these pictures are going to have an influence on us. Now, what's interesting is that there's a variety of studies that have been looking at this and have used different measures. This particular one I like because it has a behavioral measure as well as the feeling measure. In other words, it has some outcome that is measuring our actions, and another one that is measuring our subjective feelings. And what's interesting is the participants, all they were asked to do was to pour and consume as much as they wanted to of something they've never had before, a novel drink. So this is a beverage, they've never had it before, and they're just asked to pour and drink as much of it as they want. What was interesting is exposure to the happy face in a subliminal way led people to drink more of this novel beverage that they've never had before. But it had no effect on their subjective ratings of their mood or arousal. So how they felt subjectively, their conscious awareness of how they felt, was not affected at all. But they react differently to the opportunity to drink something they've never had before. So that's what's kind of interesting about this. This is an example of a type of subliminal effect. Now, you maybe have heard of subliminal effects that maybe like advertisers might do, where they'll throw in subliminal messages and see if they can get people to buy more of their product. Like there was one that said that, people in a movie theater who were shown subliminal messages to go drink Coca-Cola went out and bought more soda from the lobby of the movie theater. Those results are not generally the case. The effects that we're seeing with subliminal perception are really subtle and mild, and they're not like going to make you go out and buy something, so don't worry about that too much. But it is interesting that it does not affect how we subjectively feel, but it makes us more open to doing something, to drinking something we haven't had before. So Paul Ekman, in addition to seeing if these expressions were universal, he started to wonder if they affect how we feel. So he had participants move their eyebrows, their eyes, their mouth, and so on, and led them to pose an expression. He never told them, smile, or look happy, or look sad. He would tell them, for example, to raise their eyebrows, open their eyes wide, and open their mouth in an O shape, and see what that felt like through self-report, as well as through measuring the autonomic nervous system. In other words, measuring their heart rate, their sweat gland activity, that part of the nervous system that goes through our body and innervates our different physical systems. And so an individual like this would start off with a neutral expression and then one by one be told to raise the eyebrows and open the eyes wide and maybe to pull the mouth back a little bit while the researchers measured how this person was reacting physiologically as well as their self-report. And guess what? Doing this influences people's reactions to things and influences how we feel. And we start looking at how important facial expression is in terms of influencing how we feel, we find that it's actually fairly important. So you may have heard of Botox, right? So Botox causes paralysis of your facial muscles. And Botox injections are used cosmetically to reduce wrinkle lines on the face and stuff like that. Well, women that had just had Botox injections of their facial muscles reported moods that were less negative. It also led to their amygdala in their brain having less activity when they were imitating angry expressions. In other words, it actually blunted the effects of imitating angry expressions on their mood. And similarly, chewing gum can impair detection of emotions in pictures. So if you're chewing gum while you're looking at these pictures, for example, you will not be able to identify them quite as well. Isn't that interesting? Doesn't it suggest then that our face's own reactions to other people's expressions is important in guiding our interpretations of those facial expressions? And if that's the case, it means that other people's expressions are generating expressions in our face. And that is absolutely the case. In other words, when I see someone smile, it produces a little bit of activity in the muscles around my mouth and my eyebrows and my eyes that mimic a smile. And that influences how I feel just a little tiny bit. Your book discusses some of these theories that describe what determines the emotions that we experience. How are these emotions generated? How do they happen? What's the connection between our mind and body? And so the first one that they look at is the James-Lange Theory. And I'll have you take a look at your book for this primarily, but basically the James-Lange Theory focused a lot on the body's physical reactions and those physical reactions telling our brain what emotion to feel. So your heart beats in your chest first, and then you realize you're afraid. In contrast, the cognitive theory says that our cognitions come first. We think first. I determine that there's something here that's threatening to me or something here that I'm worried about, and then I feel afraid. And then there's the integrative embodiment theory that says that our emotions do get integrated and embodied through our physiological systems, our musculature, and our facial expressions. And so this last one kind of promotes the idea of it being kind of a two-way street between the mind and the body and emotions.